I just have a few announcements to make before I introduce everybody on the panel. First, of course, welcome to all of you, and welcome to our Haystack people who are in charge of the live streaming. Excuse me. This is our third event in a series we call The University Worth Fighting For. And that title is because the charge of the Futures Initiative, which was the main sponsor for this event, is both to enact change in higher education from within and to fight for public education as a public good. And so all of our series has some relevance to ways we think the university can and should be expanded, at least tacitly. I want to mention that tomorrow from 11 until 1 p.m. in room 3317, the Futures Initiative is hosting a teach-in and learn-in for the election, and we're mainly focusing on how graduate students who are also teaching out of the CUNY campuses can allow and create a space in their classes for their students to talk about or in some ways learn more about the precedents, the history, the importance, the future for this election. As you all know, Governor Cuomo, Mayor de Blasio, and Chancellor Milliken have all written quite forceful statements in opposition to the ideology of our president-elect, and that's partly because of who we are as a university and the university system and what we mean. And so tomorrow we'll be helping to give faculty resources in those conversations, both pedagogical tools and actual bibliography. So anyone is welcome to come to that, to those events. Actually online already is the election clapback syllabus. It's about 15 pages long just already. People are already contributing, and maybe we can write the URL for that somewhere on the blackboard or something so people can see and use that resource already or contribute to it. On your tables, there's a bunch of handouts. One is a list of all of the Futures Initiative courses that are going to be offered in the spring. And if you're a graduate student still in courses, we very much invite you to participate in those courses. One of the things that we try to do is include the undergraduates that the graduate students are teaching in the classes. So in the spring, we're going to be having a symposium featuring graduate student work, including their teaching work and what they're doing in their classes. And then we also invite you immediately after this panel discussion to a small reception and a book signing, books at the back of the room, of film Blackness. For our panel today, I'm going to introduce all three of our distinguished speakers. Each of the speakers will be talking very briefly, probably about 5, 6, 7 minutes. And then after they each talked about the media blackness in their own particular area of specialization and interest, they're going to start asking each other questions and get into a discussion, and then we will open the questions to the audience. One thing we've been trying to do at the Futures Initiative is break out of the one person dominating the Q&A pattern that we all see in our classes and at most conversations, and we've been using methods that the American Psychological Association calls total participation, which are inventory methods that have been used in classrooms to make sure that all students get to participate and speak, and we're going to be trying one of those before we go into the Q&A, and that's what the pens and the index cards are for. So if you've never done Think, Pair, Share before, you will be learning that method. On the Haystack blog, there's also a 10 ways to turn your classroom into an engaged classroom blog that has lots of different inventory methods. What we know is that the academy tends to replicate itself unless you break through the kinds of inequalities that come out in both the lecture and in the seminar form. So that's one of the things we're going to be focusing on in the Q&A. So our panelists, we're going to begin with Michael Gillespie, who's Associate Professor of Film at City College. Dr. Gillespie is a film theorist and historian with an interest in Black visual and expressive culture, film theory, genre, visual historiography, global cinema, adaptation theory, popular music studies, and contemporary art. His new book, Film Blackness, American Cinema and the Idea of Black Film, was just published by Duke University Press. And it frames Black film alongside literature, music, art, photography, and other forms of Black visual and expressive culture. Our second speaker is Racquel Gates, who's an assistant professor of cinema and media studies at the College of Staten Island. And Dr. Gates specializes in the representation of Blackness in popular culture. Her work has appeared in journals such as Television and New Media, Film Quarterly, the anthologies Watching While Black, and Saturday Night, centering the television of Black audiences and Saturday Night Live and American TV. She's currently completing a book called Double Negative, The Black Image in Popular Culture, also under contract at Duke University Press. And then our third speaker today will be Professor Shelly Eversley from Baruch College. Dr. Eversley teaches American Feminist and Black Studies. She is the academic director of CUNY's Faculty Fellowship Publication Program and is the founder of the EqualityArchive.com. She's the author of The Real Negro, The Question of Authenticity in 20th Century African American Literature, which was published by Routledge, as well as many essays. She's the editor of the Modern Libraries, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavo Suasa, The African, and editor of The Sexual Body in the 1970s, both special issues of Women's Studies Quarterly. She's editing the forthcoming book on 1960s African American literature and culture and transition for Cambridge, and is writing a new book entitled The Practice of Blackness, or Integration's Discontent. We have three very, very distinguished speakers today. It's certainly a timely subject. At the end of Dr. Gillespie's book, he notes, opening an aperture illuminates, and stopping down or closing one does not. The idea of Black film is always a question, never an answer. And I think that extends to the idea of Black media. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. And the only thing else I'll say is after this is over, I hope you'll call your senators and talk to your senators about what you're thinking about this election. It can make a difference right now. Michael?
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming out. I want to begin especially by thanking Bettina and Donica and Lauren, and particularly Cathy and everyone at the Futures Initiative for this event today. So I'd like to begin with kind of some general thoughts about how one can conceive of media blackness more broadly before specifically getting to my research on film blackness. It seems to me that now more than ever, we need to have a much more pressing investment in thinking about what are our expectations which are generated by this idea of Black art across media. And I say that right now it's particularly important because I'm quite excited about the kind of contemporary art that's being produced, and particularly this year alone in terms of the kinds of films. How many people have seen Moonlight? Okay, we need more hands. We really do. It's a stunning film, but also it's a stunning provocation of what our expectations may have been of what Black film might be capable of. And in that way, I think one way of thinking about media blackness is to think about Black visual and expressive culture in terms of multitudes and capacities, rather than strictly thinking about how it might corroborate the social category of race. That's not to disparage the social sciences, but I'm not a social scientist, and that's not how I derive pleasure from the arts. So how can we supplement what has usually been this insistence on corroboration of the lived experience with race with the broader thinking around the art of blackness? Okay? So my research, or the book particularly, Film Blackness, American Cinema, and the Idea of Black Film, came out, we might have to think back for a little bit to those days when you actually paid money for the Village Voice. And the Village Voice had announced that they were going to be doing a special roundtable discussion. This roundtable was going to be addressing Spike Lee's film Clockers. So Clockers, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's an adaptation of the successful Richard Price novel, a kind of contemporary noir staging, essentially about a crime that's committed, and one detective's insistence on who must be the killer. So my expectation out of this special roundtable when it was announced was that it would be people like Andre Saris and various other figures that we can associate with kind of the auteur criticism and general scene of film criticism that we associate with New York City. But in fact, when that special roundtable discussion came out in print, it was comprised of an emergency medical technician, a drug dealer, and a New York City police officer. Each question that they were asked, they were particularly asked what were their impressions of the film. The drug dealer said it was a bad film because drug dealers don't use the expression clockers. The New York City police officer said it was a bad film because unfortunately the film suggested that New York City police officers could be racist. And the emergency medical technician said that Clockers was a bad film because the gunshots didn't look real. And it kind of particularly struck me that the missing question was that did anyone realize that they were watching a film? And I think that that becomes this ever-pressing need that critics and regular viewers alike need to keep in mind, is that when we're watching some kind of rendering of blackness on the screen, we're watching something that could be thought of in terms of a process, a discourse, something about the experimentalizing nature of blackness and more broadly, rather than strictly something that we might immediately think of as unreflected truth. So I'd like to close with a few rhetorical questions that I posed in the book to kind of lay the way to what's to come. So for me, Film Blackness suspends the idea of black film for pushing for a more expansive understanding of blackness in cinema. What do we mean when we say black film? Black directors, actors, or strictly content? What do we mean, and does this mean that we're talking about Charles Burnett and not Jim Jarmusch? Oscar Michaud's Within Our Gates and not David Gordon Green's George Washington? Is Soul Plane more black than Ganja and Hess? What does the designation black film promise and what does it disallow? My hope is that film blackness might be a way to might be an insistent resolve to re-accentuate the values attributed to black film and generated by an abounding confluence of the art of cinema and black discursivity. I'm demanding more ambition for the idea of black film as critical capacity and not agential authority. What if black film could be something other than embodied? What if black film was immaterial and bodiless? What if black film could be speculative or just ambivalent? What if black film is ultimately the worst window imaginable and an even poorer mirror? What if black film is art or creative interpretation and not merely the visual transcription of the black life world? Thank you.
So I just wanted to begin with a couple of sort of thoughts to kick off the conversation. I don't have anything particularly prepared. So I'll begin by way of anecdote of watching at least the first 10 minutes of Saturday Night Live, and then I fell asleep. And sort of watching Saturday Night Live with Dave Chappelle hosting, and also then sort of reading my Facebook and Twitter feeds and seeing how people were responding to it, and having a bit of a disconnect between what people were saying, which was based solely on the content of Dave Chappelle's The Election Night sketch that I'm thinking about, where he's sort of responding to the news that Trump wins. But notice, thinking about the questions that were not being asked, such as I had a conversation via text with a colleague who said, isn't it interesting that there are none of the other black cast members of SNL in this sketch, that it's Dave Chappelle and he has literally imported Chris Rock to sort of sell this message. Thinking about questions of labor, what does it mean to have Chris Rock return as a successful alumni of SNL when he was largely marginalized the entire time that he was on the show, much like every other black person who's ever been on SNL. And so what does having him return as sort of a successful rich black alumni, how does that obscure sort of issues of labor and racism in the history of the show, which we know is an ongoing problem. So I'm opening with that sort of anecdote to get into the questions that I'm most interested in terms of my research, which are popular culture. And you know, Michael writes about things like Medicine for Melancholy. I write about Love and Hip Hop and Coming to America. And, I say that because I think that there are these ways that Black popular culture, however we're defining it, has lacked this type of critical rigor in terms of analysis, and we tend to get stuck at questions of authenticity and representation without sort of thinking about aesthetics and labor and affect and audiences, all of which are questions I think can lead us into a more robust, complicated and nuanced discussion about Black film and Black popular culture, however we're defining that. Some of the questions I'm interested in that I think complement Michael's quite nicely are how does Blackness become legible in popular culture, and how does Blackness become legible via things like genre, and aesthetics. So for example, my work is very focused on this question of quality and what does quality mean. And when I tell people that I write about Black popular culture and I study Black popular culture, they typically say, "Oh, you mean The Wire?" And I go, "No, I don't watch The Wire. Why is that the one Black show that you want to talk about?" And so one of the things that I mention in the book is my questioning of The Wire as sacred Black text, partly because it's buffered by these other forms of quality, such as being on HBO, which has its own sort of economic and taste culture behind it, and why are we talking about only The Wire as opposed to something like Love and Hip Hop, right? And so thinking about the ways that quality itself is a race category as opposed to a neutral category that we can sort of apply in that way. So I'm going to stop there, but those are some of the things that I'm interested in, and I think we'll have a good and vigorous discussion about it. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for having me. I work in literature mostly, and so I am coming at this from a digital project, Equality Archive, that I imagined. And I wrote some notes because I'm not so good at improvising. So early in Michael's film Blackness, he asked the question, does any good really come from refusing to let art exceed your expectations? When I read that question, I wanted to stand up and cheer. To me, his question is an invitation to resist looking for authenticity in film and in Blackness, in order to be open to the possibility, to multiple possibilities, to what he emphasizes as, quote, an always disruptive surprise. There's freedom, I'd like to posit with Michael, following Michael. There's freedom in the disruptive surprise, and for some that freedom might be scary, since it ultimately demands that the viewers of Black film abandon what they think they already know. But this disruption also gives credit to the imagination, to art, in a way that I know is absolutely crucial to freedom. For instance, when Isabella Baumfree was enslaved, she had to imagine a freedom she did not know. And then she made the choice to risk acting on that possibility. In so doing, Sojourner Truth found freedom, and she changed the world. That last point is no understatement, and I'm offering this up because as a teacher and as a scholar in the middle of her career, I think a lot about the ways in which what we do has to be transgressive. It has to inspire action. Her example, Isabella Baumfree's example, is Isabella Baumfree, who becomes Sojourner Truth. Her example changed the world, and it set an example for us to imagine, or imagine all the things that we don't know. Equality Archive, my digital project, is a digital theater for the intersecting people, history, and issues relevant to feminist thought and action in the United States. I'm going to shout out right now, Lori Herson over there. She built it. I imagined it, and then she actually built it. Thank you, Lori. And she's a great collaborator, a feminist collaborator. It takes seriously the notion that thinking inspires action. And like Cathy's iPod experiment, it advocates the multitasking of attention. On Equality Archive, this is quoting Cathy, she says, everything links to everything, and it's available all the time. And I think about that seriously when, when you get a chance to take a look at Equality Archive, you'll notice that it just, it's a website. And when we're trying to imagine it, we're trying to imagine this website when you can search keywords, you can search people, you can search issues, you can search social justice organizations, and then there's highlights, and so that literally you can click on a word in a tag cloud, and then you'll find all of these names, events, and issues that intersect with each other, and that's what we could imagine at the moment when we think about making feminist thought and action visible and visual and available all the time for free. It's also important for me to describe this to say that when I came up with the idea and Laurie was building the project, we didn't really know who was going to read it. We didn't really know what it would look like or how people would receive it. And what's really interesting to me in terms of exceeding our expectations is probably more people have called me about this than anything I've ever written, any book I've ever published, any conference paper I've ever given. And these entries are written by colleagues. These entries are written by artists, by professors, by feminists, by students, and they're fact-checked and they're peer-reviewed, and they contain film, sound, books, articles, hyperlinks, lots of images, and the site is responsive because if you had an iPod, which I guess now is called an iPhone, you could actually access it and scroll. The entries are short. There are 400 words about each, and they're loaded with information. And the idea is that with that knowledge, with this thinking, learning something that you might not have known before or something that you might not have expected before, you might be inspired to act. And so each asset literally is connected to an opportunity to get involved in a social organization, not necessarily to donate your money, but to donate your time. And that's really important to me and to us. And I think one of the intersections that we're having today on this panel. The last thing I wanted to say is that Equality Archive is experimental. It's an experimental staging of intersectionality. And in this way, hopefully it inspires feminist ambition in the same way that Michael's talking about in his book, the ambition for multiple modalities, the ambition to have art exceed our expectations is to imagine something that we don't know is possible. It's to put it out there to see what comes back. And so this is our goal with Equality Archive, and it's something that I hope as you take a look at it, you can see the intersections that transcend just the limits of how we understand gender or how we understand sex or even race as somehow discrete categories that only overlap in footnotes. We wanted to kind of bring those intersections alive as much as we could do. And in this way, it's really inspired by film because, as you know, as we all know, film's multimodality, I think, is the inspiration for us to think about multimodality in education and in digital platforms like this. So thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So I've asked each of the panelists to ask the other panelists a question. So Michael, do you want to start that off?
Sure. Okay. So I'll ask each of you kind of an individual thing, and you can paper, rock, scissors, whoever wants to start out first. Racquel, could you talk a little bit about the ways in which, in your own kind of scholarship, but also the ways in which your scholarship is begun to circulate, how about these kind of residual traces of respectability politics? And I say, I suppose I'm being very optimistic by saying that there are just residual traces. Mm-hmm. I would think Bill Cosby has killed the notion of respectability politics, but again, that might be my optimism. So, and Shelly, I'm curious about, the site is fabulous, and what I'm particularly interested in is the ways in which you're almost kind of, my initial kind of circulation through it, I couldn't help but constantly think about Robin Kelley's measure of freedom dreams Freedom Dreams with an intersection of archive fever. So yeah. So I was hoping you could talk about I guess what I'm tentatively thinking about in terms of Black archive fever and how that might have informed your construction of the site.
Okay, sure. All right, so respectability, and I think particularly with the Black image and Black representation,
Right.
It's just a hard thing to kill. Like even with the Bill Cosby stuff, there is this entrenched notion. Thank you. There's this entrenched notion that representations do a certain type of work in sort of one or two directions, and even though I think in terms of popular conversations we keep changing the terminology, there's still this idea that images do a certain type of labor, and what I'm interested in my research is this idea that it's much more complicated than that, right? And so the really easy example would be my obsession with reality television and the notion that people have that audiences or people sort of tune into something like Love and Hip Hop, Basketball Wives, what have you, to watch people act a fool or watch people fight. And therefore, little girls around the country are going to imitate that, and we're going to set Black people back 400 years, and I don't know, like
500.
500, thank you. The conversation just keeps going and going and going. The thing that troubles me about that is not necessarily just the fact that I think that those types of conversations sort of sell the show short, which I think they do. And I think, along with some other colleagues of mine, like Kristen Warner, that the shows on VH1 have essentially created a blueprint for something like Empire, and not just in terms of the content, but in terms of the acknowledgement of those audiences, sort of this late night African American audience who's interested in melodrama. But the other thing that sort of bothers me about those politics of respectability is that they implicitly sell short African American audiences, as if our viewing pleasures can't be complicated in the ways that the field of media studies has already talked about with with white audiences, for example. And so the question of Black audiences reading against the grain or viewing things as satire, all of that sort of gets lost in this unidirectional sort of representational mode of the Black image, which is the thing that I'm really trying to complicate in my work.
Cool.
So thanks for your question.
No, thank you.
I was thinking about your project and this idea of quality. This morning, lately, anyway. I'm trying not to look at my phone, reach for my phone when I as soon as I wake up. Started last Wednesday. It's just too much to bear sometimes as I move through my day. But usually I roll over and then I'm like, don't do it, and then I grab my phone anyway, and then I cruise the news. And a headline I saw on The Guardian was that the president-elect and his people just sent their plan for Black urban communities, and they delivered it to mediatakeout.com. And the quote was, "Media Takeout is the highest trafficked website, the most visited website that African Americans use." And if you all don't know Media Takeout is the National Enquirer of Black culture, right? So it is the place where all kinds of made-up stories about Black celebrities show up. It's also really highly trafficked. And so it'll be really fun to see how your book complicates that, because of course, now this is the place. This is where Donald Trump identifies as the place in which to communicate with African Americans about his policy plans for African Americans in urban impoverished areas. So I think about that, and then I think about my website, right? Because obviously when Lori and I were building it, and when I was imagining it, and she was like, "Yeah, we could do that. Let's make it happen." I went to a lot of websites, and I went to a lot of websites that had a look and a traffic that was different. And it started because I was thinking about how to teach my students about the Equal Rights Amendment, one that they hadn't heard of and one that they were shocked whenever they found out that it had been presented to Congress for nearly 100 years, every year, and still not passed. And in so doing, we actually modeled Equality Archive based on advertising on the Nike websites and Puma and Adidas. It's literally a model that's lifted from them, and fortunately Lori knows how to like go underneath a website and figure out how they did it. Oh no, you can do that. But that's really important, because when we talk about quality and we talk about packaging, sometimes there's an opportunity then for us to actually offer up some reliable information, some archival information that can kind of balance the sort of the fictions that appear sensationally and in very popular modes in media takeout and Boss-Up and for Harriet and all these places that are now literally the site for commentary in the Black public sphere. And I'm hoping, and of course this one has no ads, this one has no sponsors, and so it just happens to, the fantasy is that it'll just circulate through Twitter and all those other means that people use to access information. But now there's sort of counter information, and that counter information is actually reliable, and it's fact checked, and that is important to me, because it seems to me that if we have the information, so for instance in here there's an entry on Georgia Gilmore, which the fabulous Pramila Nasdin, I hope you all know her, she wrote a really cool essay about Georgia Gilmore, who was a regular Black woman. She was a cook in the 50s, and she cooked soul food. And her house, her kitchen, became the place where Martin Luther King met LBJ, because it was the place that they knew wasn't under surveillance. It's the place where they made pies and sold pies for money, so that they could figure out a carpool during the Montgomery bus boycott. And these kinds of moments, I never heard of Georgia Gilmore. I never really thought about those kinds of archival moments where it's just an everyday person who had the potential to change the world. And then you link her to Martin Luther King, and then all of a sudden the possibilities become endless. And of course that entry, like all entries here, are tweetable. You just press the button and tweet it, which is great, because that's how people who go to media takeout access the news. And now we have an archive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to go ahead and ask your question?
So I'll turn my question to Michael first, and then to Shelly. So Michael, you asked, what do we mean when we say Black film? And the question I'd like to pose to you is, what do we mean when we say film? Because it seems to me that in this moment, the idea of film in terms of you go to the movie theater, you sit down, that's getting complicated a bit. And my students, it's like pulling teeth to try to get them to go into a movie theater, because they want to watch everything on their phones, which has all kinds of implications aesthetically, but narratively, but also thinking about attention spans. And so I think particularly now that we're seeing more Black media makers taking advantage of these sort of digital forums, and with sites like Netflix and Amazon sort of jumping into the original programming market, and the fact that Nate Parker, I think, was debating between releasing Birth of a Nation sort of as a theatrical release versus Netflix, and thinking about what that could have meant in terms of the film's reception, I think, are interesting questions.
Right.
So that's my sort of question for you, and then my question for Shelly, knowing a bit about your background in different, crossing different disciplines, one of the things that I'm always interested in is the ways that those of us who study media blackness tend to get siloed sort of in our disciplines, and so there are conversations happening in film and media studies that seem completely separate from those happening in history, which are different than those happening in English. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the really sort of awesome potential of the web, and particularly your site, to bridge those divides and create some kind of interdisciplinarity among scholars or users. among scholars?
Great question.
Okay,
I'm like, how do I answer that? Well, I would say that it really wasn't. It was a stepping out of faith. I think that this project actually came to be because I got tired of sitting in all these meetings where they're telling me that I need to figure out how to blog in class or figure out how to use this program to grade to blog more class people in the classroom. And I needed to find an entree for my participation in the digital innovations that are happening around us, that are here, that are already affecting how we teach, but where would I stand in all this? So there's that. And it's also true that it's a very lonely place. CUNY can be, if you're off at one of the colleges and you don't really have research tools, research funds, you don't have a lot of support, and then you're teaching, the course that's outside of your discipline already, so you might as well kind of keep going, especially because you love your students and you know that they need to be empowered in a way that's practical and in a way that works for them. I know that most of our students at CUNY do a lot of their homework on the train, on the subway, when they get on the train from Brighton Beach or from wherever they live, and they're on that train for an hour, one way or more, then they're reading, and we give them parts of books all the time, and I don't, but we do. And so I think that part of the interdisciplinary, or maybe the potential of this, is because it's free, it's open source, and it's always available to continue. I was so happy when I read that quote of Cathy's from the Chronicle so long ago. She says it's always available all the time, and it's always connected. And I think that is a moment for our students to think, for us to even do it, because of course neither of you are writing books that are only inside of your discipline. You're reading around, you're reading the sources of your colleagues, you're reading people you don't know, you're reading outside of film, you're reading literature, you're reading poems, you're watching films, you're listening to music, and so we wanted to do the same. So that would be my answer. And the question now is how do you get it out? Because of course now even for something to go viral, you have to pay. You have to pay for the advertising or for the boost. And so what I'm finding is then all of a sudden I have to turn on like my publicist hat, and I need to like drop a line to the people at Mashable, like, hey, have you seen this? And then they call me back. And one day Mashable did an article and it got 10,000 visitors in an hour. Like, wow, who knew? And that was free. It was a little bit of hustle that a lot of us as academics aren't used to doing, but it was really useful. And I keep waiting, because then this guy from BuzzFeed keeps saying, well, when are we going to talk about it? And I keep thinking, okay, I just need to do the next iteration. We need to like boost the entries and then go ahead, because if Mashable can do that, then BuzzFeed's going to do this. And that's important. And I have no idea who these people are when they read a little post on BuzzFeed that disappears so quickly. But I do know that they're looking, they show up. So that's the goal. That's the longer term goal. And if anyone wants to contribute to help the volume, great, because I'm waiting. I keep telling them that we'll do more. Submissions at equalityarchive.com. And then even if it's just, you have an idea, you could just send it, and then we can flesh it out, because it is really a collective. And that's the other important thing I wanted to say, is that none of these entries are signed. So while they're all written by experts and specialists, they're part of a collective. So you'd have to do some serious sleuthing to see who actually wrote the entry. And I think that's part of the collaboration that is feminist practice that I think does transcend the silos that we get stuck in when we think we have to be the rock star, the only one in the village. My question for both of you then goes... Oh, sorry.
Have you mentioned?
Oh,
sorry.
No worries. So it's good. It's good coffee. So what is film, right? In terms of this. So the term that comes to mind, and I mean this in the non-Deleuzian sense, is the cinematic. And for me, my staging of that term cinematic is tied most immediately to one of the things that I kind of realized by the time I'd finished the book. There was an expression just kind of came to me that in a sense was the compelling force for the book, which was, my own Black cinephilia. and that I had spoken about it in every other conceivable term other than that, right? And so, and I mean that in the sense that for my appreciation of the cinematic is always thinking of across these platforms of various kind of spectatorial conceits of how one watches, how one experiences that, how one maps out the particular giving oneself over in a non-episodic sense. And that becomes increasingly difficult when you, let's say, try to have to argue for why it's important to screen films in class. And of course, why it's important to screen films in class is like, I'd never say to someone in an English department of like, you don't really have to read all of Beowulf, just get to the end, get to she in the cave or whatever. I mean, that is an exciting part, but I think it's also about the reason why you screen films in class is to essentially teach people how to watch films or what might be the most productive way of watching films. It's not to say that people don't know how to watch it, but I think people are more willing to be distracted in how they watch films, which is kind of antithetical to kind of appreciating, what makes it so formally exciting, right? So particularly, because I'm also, moving on and doing some work for, looking at things like the Future State series that PBS had put online, which is strictly a YouTube base, again, trying to insist on applying the same kind of practices that one would think about in terms of a more kind of captive theatrical moment as inspiring a particular kind of reading. So, yeah.
Mike, I'm not even going to tell you about a certain very famous Marxist scholar who taught at the institution I used to be at, who used to watch 2 or 3 films at the same time, often in different languages, on different TVs with a remote while reading a book.
Yeah. Like my favorite thing is when I heard Rita Dub give a talk once where she would talk about that her process for writing her poetry was to have this small television on her black and white TV that she would just put on her desk and just turn it on. And then she would just write. And to me, that is the dream. Because I love having, I know some people that need to basically be in a sensory deprivation tank, but I don't actually need that.
That's how I sleep.
Yeah. All right.
Shelly? That's great.
I was just trying to think of my question, which because if it's always a question, then I'm not sure what my next question would be, except for the multimodality, the multiple possibilities. I was really intrigued by what I read of your book so far about the idea of the possible that we don't know yet, and the possible that we don't know yet that we might see in a film, and all the parts that make a film communicate with the viewer, and the work that the viewer has to do to get to those possibilities. And so I wonder what that would mean if you added feminism.
Right.
That's just the question. It's not a great question. It's just the question.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a question that came up while I was writing the book, and I think what made this year particularly difficult in terms of letting the book go was that as soon as I let the book go, there were so many amazing things that ended up coming out that I wanted to most immediately talk about. And one of those things, which I'm working through now, is Anna Rose Holmer's film The Fits. And what particularly makes The Fits important for me is to think about this somewhat through Amy Meredith Cox's work on choreography. And particularly thinking, what does it mean to think of a narrative of Black becoming with a Black girl protagonist, which then crosses over into these really fantastical moments. And so for me, it's about doing the constant digging and searching to kind of expand my own practice, because there are ways in which, feminism is a valuable element to kind of the way that I'm thinking of beyond the book. I would also say that you know, when in terms of teaching Black womanist or Black women or Black feminist film, that one of the most important things for me was to just call up Women Make Movies, and to be like me was to just, you know, when a teacher who really needs some other material that they'd like to do, can I just hang out in your office for the afternoon? And to just literally go through doing the keyword searches. And I spent a day there just going through dozens and dozens of films that I really never thought of before. And those films became particularly formative in expanding my practice, or expanding, you know, how I identified what was my practice.
Hmm. Any, we've got 15 minutes, so why don't we just try, thank you, those were great. That was really interesting conversation, and thank you all for being here. Let's so there are cards on everybody's table. What question would you like to ask these panelists? Just quickly, 90 seconds, just quickly write on the card a question, and I'm going to have people talk about their question with each other and then with the panelists, literally. Anything you can think of that you'd like to ask the panelists. We'll probably collect you don't have to sign them or anything, but we'll collect the cards after and probably put them in a Google Doc. What question's still on your mind after hearing this conversation? Just really, really quickly.
Because you know, when you even like television or whatever, you know, because they all always intersect.
Right.
It's super cool.
Right.
It's the same with like the popular culture, like love and hip hop. You know, I saw that so good. Because I don't watch it right now. I'm like, okay, just love hip hop. And it was really, you know, everybody in the restaurant was all.
How many people have done this think, pair, share inventory technique before? So the next thing in Think, Pair, Share is you just turn to somebody you don't know, or it could be somebody you know, somebody you're sitting next to, and take turns reading your question. You know, in other words, one person read, the other person read, and then just think about how those two questions go together and talk about it together. You do this in a classroom because every student should be able to hear their own voice once in the classroom. And in fact, the sociologists who go into classrooms and measure that, about 20% of students speak in a typical classroom. Just find somebody at your table and just take turns reading your question once. If there's five, No, just read your question to somebody else and let them read it to you, and then talk about the. But I know better. I know better. I was graduate in situation. You know, schedule a little something. I try to make it seem casual, but I'm not that. You know, whenever I go off the cuff, I go too long. And also, you're thinking about the connections with your project, and it's just like. There's so much to say. There should actually.
Did I actually write that by?
Yeah. It's like it's on. It's in the first 20 pages.
Yeah.
That's probably, you know,
That's what happens when you revise question.
it's a great question. Because I was like,
Because I don't think I read that.
you did. But wait. Here it is. I'll show you. See, look. And I was like, great. Yeah. And then see, I got all excited.
Wow.
That's what
That's what
Then I was
that's
like,
what a lot of revising will do for you.
because I was like, exceeding the expectations. Because, you know, the idea that you already have to, that art is
Right.
something that isn't supposed to be accepted. Because you're actually going beyond the claim of
Right.
film.
Because that happens to us all the time. That we go to a film and it ruffles our feathers, it defies what our expectation was. But I think conditionally, we live in a culture that will always say that
So one reason
that feeling that you
that Think, Pair, Share works in the classroom is you can take the dull in class and get this kind of energy.
Yeah.
Because it's always does that, of course, you lose yourself.
Right.
And all the things that you think are solid about yourself and about what you know.
So maybe
and
we
that's why
should,
it's kind of
Shelly, do you want to
more
do
than I understood it to be more than just claiming art, black film blackness. It's like, you know, just
So,
circulating
if I could have attention back.
lose yourself,
Yeah.
you know.
By the way, I think this is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Which is why I was trying to connect it to.
Does anyone have a question that you talked about in your group that you would like to ask to our panel?
New name.
Wow.
He knew it like it's a new me.
Okay, please. Oh, did you say that? Go ahead.
We had two questions about quality.
Yeah.
Because I'll just read both the questions. Thinking about quality as a raised category, how do we begin to complicate, unpack, make visible this issue? And the other was more on blackness and quality. I'm thinking about how we live in an era of quality TV, but blackness somehow seems separate from that quality. So these are sort of overlapping.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, so yeah, thank you. That's I'm sort of obsessed with these questions of quality. And so another anecdote, I was having a Facebook discussion years ago with a colleague of mine, and she was sort of crowdsourcing or doing this, hey, let's list some Black cult films. And over the course of the discussion, we just ended up listing every single Black film we could think of. And sort of the takeaway being, well, what is a Black cult film if there is no such thing as sort of a canonical Black film? Because Blackness is already always outside of the category of what mainstream culture deems to be quality, right? And that's, to me, where we start to unpack that. Which is not, when I gave my anecdote about The Wire, it's not to knock The Wire, it's to say, why does that become the thing, right? Or even something like Empire. Why does Empire get to do the kind of stuff that it does on that show? Partly because it's beautiful, and it's got, it's buffered by how many Academy Award nominees that are on the show, either as regular cast members or showing up, and Lee Daniels is the showrunner, and we've got Kehinde Wiley paintings in the back. I mean, it's got all to identify those moments, for me, is sort of that first step in trying to chip away at some of that and sort of complicate the notion of quality, or even the idea of melodrama, right? In the ways that, melodrama is not typically seen as a quote unquote quality genre in terms of how we talk about it. But then we look at sort of Black audiences' attraction to soap opera and late night soap and things like that. And I think that understanding those connections, again, helps us sort of begin to deconstruct how quality is functioning in that way.
Yeah. Can I add to that? Yeah. So thanks for the question. I think a few things kind of came to mind when you were talking, and these are things that have been on my mind a lot lately. Particularly in terms of this investment in measures of quality with television. I adore Atlanta, but I'm really, really tired of all this is the blackest thing we've ever seen conversation that seems to go on about it. Because I think what makes it so wonderful is the kind of formal experimentation that's going on. And I look forward to that being a part of the conversation about Atlanta, which I think is why it is so successful. And I think that can lend itself to kind of reanimating our measure of what quality means for, blackness in television. And another thing that came to mind about questions of quality, I'm thinking of 3 films in particular I've seen this year and I'm kind of writing on and kind of adoring. And again, in particular, but also the film Hunter-Gatherer and the Everybody Dies sequence from the film Collective Unconscious. And what's particular about these 3 films for me is the ways in which they're part of what I'm thinking of as a kind of momentum around Black independent cinema, which, particularly has made me rethink some of the ideas which came out of the context of Latin American cinema of the 60s, of this idea of a deliberately imperfect cinema. And I think that since 2009, that we have been experiencing a rather important and exciting measure of Black imperfect cinema that I look forward to it to continue to accrue and grow. But again, it's complicating how we address these terms around quality. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely moments in Atlanta where I'm just like, yep, I know that guy. He's probably still on Beaufort Highway, but but yet, it's still the form which I think is the driving part of what makes it such a wonderful television series. So,
Can I
thanks.
just say one quick thing?
Yeah,
I just thought about this when you were talking about, and I'm sorry, I forgot the woman's name, one of the figures you're profiling on the website.
Gilmore.
Yes, and the conversation started like happening in the kitchen and things like that. I mean, I thought about that in connection to Media Takeout, about these spaces where we don't think the work happens, or we're sort of not paying attention to because they're not, the kitchen is to the living room as Media Takeout is to, I don't know, whatever respectable website. But thinking about what gets left on the table then? So, the president-elect is going to Media Takeout. I mean, why didn't we harness Media Takeout before if it's got this huge traffic and this, partly because it's not like the right kind of people. I mean, there's something about that I find, really interesting.
I would say though that people don't go. I go to Media Takeout. It's my guilty pleasure. And maybe more people should just kind of fess up to that they actually go to Media Takeout as their, because
I go to Boston.
I go to Boss Up after. I go to Boss Up after. I do the whole cycle. Usually when I'm eating my lunch at my desk, I close the door and I'm like, let me see what's going on. And it might be something that we just have to sort of accept that our literacies and our fluencies go across those genres of news. It's also true that probably if I reached out to I'll try it. But Media Takeout, I'm not sure is going to be so quick to I have to figure out how to pitch Media Takeout. And so Donald Trump can access Media Takeout because he's already connected to Omarosa, and he's got this sort of reality TV sheen on him that fits into that genre. So I'm not sure that it makes sense for me or for us to necessarily want to assimilate that kind of sensationalism, because Media Takeout is also incredibly unreliable. So I really read it. I look at it for entertainment, but it's worth thinking about how we can do what we do in accessible language and forms. Not even to say that it dumbs down something, but that if there is a huge population that is seeking information quickly and on their phones, that it would be worth it for us to experiment with form, even if they're looking for entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was asking, I wanted to ask, do you think that now that the president's going from Obama to Trump, how do you think that's going to affect how Black people are viewed in media? Because I think that Obama and his wife had a lot to do with how people view Black people in general in this country and the world. So
And
how do
look
you
how
think
that
it's
turned out, right? Sorry. I'm
I'm not sure what that means.
Well, it's there's a really interesting piece that Jay Hoberman has been working on a bit in terms of cinema in the age of Obama. I think at one point he did a dual projection of Lincoln and 12 Years a Slave, overlaid the two, or maybe he used one of those disaster films with only a disaster can happen when there's a Black president. But he had this kind of really interesting experiment about that. So I think that if there could be a way that we could quantify the influence of the Obamas on, say, mainstream cinema, we could perhaps say there was a bit more optimism, whether that's realistic or otherwise. But I think in general, Hollywood's motivation to care about culture and society is always driven by revenue. So, and I think in general, regardless of whether Trump was being president or not, that we just need to slowly divest from any hope for Hollywood. I think we should just really, there's just too many good things that are coming out for us to worry about what Hollywood is giving us.
I have an anecdote really fast, and this is about Black people and Trump. And I'm from Baltimore, and I'm very proud from Baltimore, and proud Baltimorean. And so the last week I've been having this argument on Facebook, which I've never actually been involved in an argument on Facebook, with my best friend from when I was 12, and the differences between our lives. He went to prison and I went to Columbia. And he's now becoming like the respectable guy. So he makes this post and he says, these people, why are these people protesting? It's so silly. Let's let the rule of law. And he's like, basically, he's like, regurgitating, this sort of Trump supporter language about dissent. And I'm like, what's going on? So we have this, so first I'm like, who are these people and all these things? And then I realize in this argument that he, in his mind, is claiming to be rational, objective, and calm.
Right.
So that he won't get locked up again? I don't know. Like, in this sort of, he's posing respectability in the same way that media Takeout and Omarosa, because now they have Trump's ear, might very well become the mouth. They just swallow the Kool-Aid and spit it back out. And he is, this, my friend, is on the streets in Baltimore. And he is, carrying himself like he's got this authority and this respectability, and all these people are loving what he's saying, and I'm like, what happened? How did this happen in a week? And I have a feeling that there's going to be more of that. When I think about my family, my working class family, who are not here reading these fancy books, they are trying to get through the day, and they're trying to class up real quick, where it used to be that they'd go to church and hallelujah, and people would respect them, or they thought people respected them because they were church-going Christians. Now that it's even gone more to the right, I wonder if they're going to start using language like, these people are fools. I couldn't believe it. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I do think that it's really important that we figure out all the frequencies and start communicating on all of them.
So you're saying your friend that was in jail, you're saying you're not respecting the fact that he's taken the direction he's taking with everything happened is like more conservative?
It's incredibly conservative. It's not that I'm not respecting it, I don't know when it happened. I've known this guy since I was 12 years old. I spent my adolescence in his house, right? So that all of a sudden, all of a sudden in the last week and a half, he's posting a lot about these people and these protests and giving up these connections that are repeating this sort of Trump language. And I'm really, I don't know when it happened that he turned to this point of view, because, we lived 3 doors from each other when we were kids, and he's been through a lot of things that I haven't been through, and vice versa. But it's just, I don't know when it happened that he is like this secret Trump guy, black man, who can't vote because he's a felon, is now become this Trump guy.
Well, I think that people are either going to take the route where they go crazy and they, lose it, and then some people are going to internalize it different and just like accept it and keep living their life and making things happen. There's only 2 ways you can do it. It happened. It's here.
I was going to, just to also contextualize my sort of cynical outburst. I've also had so much coffee today. I think if there's these ways, in response to your question, if we think about like Barack Obama as a media text as opposed to, the president, it doesn't get much more quality than Barack and Michelle Obama, which is the thing I'm sort of obsessed with, right? I mean, they are about as respectable, quality, like you could not have designed them any better on paper. And yet, and still, when voters went to elect the next president, I don't know that did the work that I think a lot of us assumed it to. I mean, that's sort of what I'm getting at, is we sort of assume that putting forth quality images, I keep putting that in quotes, right? Like quality images of blackness is going to do this work that it just doesn't do, quite frankly. Right. And so I think it's important for us to really complicate our understanding of what that means, and then what did it happen, right? I mean, I'm thinking of all of the moments during Barack Obama's presidency where something real like racy would happen, and somebody would say something, and there'd be sort of national outcry, and like the beer summit, or whatever that was, and sort of the quickness to say, okay, we won't talk about race in those moments, and thinking about what sort of got, I keep saying what we left on the table, but what was sort of allowed to sort of grow and fester in the absence of sort of those explicit conversations that I think needed to happen, but couldn't happen partly because we were dealing with sort of the respectable office of the presidency, and that there was no space for that there. But we see what happens when we don't make space for that, and we're there.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, for that. I suppose to add a little anecdote to this. So election night, I think it was around, I mean, I don't know when the panic set in and when the truth kind of set in, but I'd like to think I had kind of a fast turnaround because there was a Twilight Zone marathon that was going on. So I think it was around midnight I had made the decision that I was not going to watch any more news. And I turned to the Twilight Zone episode. Let me emphasize, this is not the original Twilight Zone. This was one of the reboots later on. And the particular episode is an episode that Erica Edwards at UC Riverside has written on. And it's an episode devoted to a man who ends up traveling back in time, and he arrives in Memphis on the week that Dr. King is assassinated. And so the whole episode, very much in the ways that we come to appreciate and adore the Twilight Zone, becomes about him trying to save Dr. King. It was very serendipitous, I think, in terms of getting my mood off what happened that night. But one of the things that did kind of make me think about most immediately was, what is my expectation of media? What is my expectation of these kind of fantastical renderings of Blackness? And I think it is to continue to provoke me, if not to keep me awake a little longer, to help me contextualize the world and contextualize the possibilities or the potentialities of the world around me.
Well, that sounds like about a perfect note on which to end, and it's also 1 o'clock. So thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking our panelists.